Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the most recent French Civilization and Culture talk here at Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution. If you don't know me, my name is Steve Wharton, and I'm co-convener with Lindsay Udall of French Civilization and Culture. Before I start, we are not expecting a fire drill, so in the event of the alarm going off, can you please leave by the closest available exit, at the risk of now looking like somebody on a British Airways film, one there and one at the back of the room. Make your way out of the building, then turn right and foregather outside the Francis Hotel, where, as I'm sure you're aware, BRLSI members get a 15% discount. It's my very great pleasure to introduce my good friend, Professor Hanna Diamond of the University of Cardiff, to talk this evening. Hannah's studies began at the University of Sussex, where she did her undergrad and postgrad, working with the late, great Professor Rod Kedward on issues around the occupation of France. And as I never tire of telling people, it's thanks to Marshal Pétard that I got to meet Hannah when we first met at a conference in 1990, which was the first serious conference by French academics on the occupation of France. And then a few years later, I was very pleased when Hannah was able to join the staff of the university here at Bath, where we worked together quite closely. That was the place from which she published her first two books, the second of which, Fleeing Hitler, was featured in a French civilization talk here some years ago. But her most recent one, published with Yale University Press, is indeed Josephine Baker's Secret War, which Hannah will be talking to us about, the woman more known for the banana dress, but as we will learn this evening, it's much, much more than that. Hannah has also very kindly provided some refreshments of which we can partake after the talk, and Mr. Bees has very kindly provided some copies of the book, so if you would like to purchase a copy, do come and see us, and we can arrange that. I'm afraid it's contactless cards only, rather than cash. And who knows, after a glass of wine, you may even be able to persuade Hannah to sign a copy. Anyway, without further ado, before you buy the book, you should hear the sales pitch. And so I now call on Hannah to talk to us about Josephine Baker, the wartime life of the African-American star. Hannah.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you also to the French Civilization and Culture Group for inviting me tonight and giving me a chance to share some of the research and the findings that I've put together in this book. And I'm hoping tonight to give you a little taster of what is there in my talk this evening. So how did I become interested in Josephine Baker? This is what everyone, the first question that everyone is asking me in all the interactions I'm having at the moment. I was actually commissioned to do some research about her in 2018, and this resulted in a long-form article in which I kind of reconstructed the first 3 years of the war, the work that Josephine Baker was doing, which was a complete eye-opener to me. I didn't know anything about these wonderful stories that I'll be talking about today. But I was amazed to find how little was actually written about Josephine Baker during this period. Scholars have written brilliant work about her extraordinary rise to fame. And let's remember that Josephine Baker, born in St. Louis in really difficult circumstances of race riots in 1905, to a very impoverished background. Her mother took in laundry, she was sent out to work at a very young age in white households, she cleaned, she did childcare, and she had this huge break because she had rhythm. She loved to dance, she would dance all the time, and she was picked up and seen by a Dixieland group and was gradually able to make her way onto Broadway. And she was recognized, some of you may have seen pictures of her pulling faces and going cross-eyed on the end of a chorus line. And she was picked up by Caroline Dudley, who was looking for dancers to take to Paris. Paris at this time in a kind of effervescence around all things African, and jazz and Charleston and all these kinds of dances were very much à la mode. And Josephine Baker came to France in 1925. Actually, she performed this dance that you can see over there, the danse sauvage with the revue nègre. And she came on stage, and this picture is a reconstruction of the dancer who carried her on stage with very few clothes, as you can see. And she did this extraordinary frenetic dance that was her version of the Charleston that left really all those in the room shocked, amazed, surprised, and she became a star literally overnight. Really, the French were amazed by her, and she just became the talk of the town, I think, in every sense. She went on to dance as well in this banana skirt that Steve actually referred to earlier. And I think her claim to fame was she both thrilled and shocked the French public. Now, there is quite a lot of work that charts her evolution in this period, the kind of dance style she had, the way in which she was able to attract the interest and become so famous and better herself. She surrounded herself with people who could improve her. She learned to sing. She became a music hall star. Here we can see the posters of her appearing at the Casino de Paris. And she also became a film star. The first of her films was a silent film, La Sirène des Tropiques. And this image she had was quite unique. And she really was beloved by the French, but also traveled across Europe. So there is work that charts the evolution of her dancing style, the way in which she was understood on film. People talk a lot about the pastiche of colonial characters that she represented. Although she was African-American, in her films, she often represented the colonial other, you know, the French Empire, the Guadeloupes, the Tunisian shepherdess. She was always the onlooker, the bystander. And there's a good deal of work that deals with this side of her work. There's also work that deals with her post-war, the post-war story. Some of you may have heard of this extraordinary experiment that Josephine Baker adopted. In the end, she adopted 12 children from all over the world, and she brought them up according to what she believed were their religious backgrounds, and brought them to her chateau in Les Milandes and made something of you can see all the people looking through the railings, she wanted people to understand how ultimately we are all human beings wherever we come from, and we can get along. And this was at the heart of her civil rights thinking and her involvement in the civil rights movement. But what is lacking in the scholarship is how we get from Josephine Baker, the dancer in her banana skirt, this wonderful, famous celebrity, to this civil rights activist here. And I really found no serious study in French or in English that dealt with this period in the middle, this period of the wartime. There's one key book, this book here, La guerre secrète de Josephine Baker, and I actually pinched that title for the title of my book, by Jacques Abté. Now, Jacques Abté, his is the most detailed source, really, to recount Josephine Baker's activities in the period, and as you can see, it's published with a letter from General de Gaulle, which gives this book an air of authenticity, but actually that's somewhat misleading. The letter from de Gaulle, although it's replicated in the book, is actually a letter of congratulation to Josephine Baker for her getting a resistance medal after the war. It doesn't directly refer to the incidents in the book. So who was Jacques Abté? Jacques Abté was head of military counterintelligence, the Deuxième Bureau, as it was known in French, from about 1936. And it was he who recruited Baker as a spy, as an honorary colleague, really. She was unpaid. And it was he who was responsible for training her to collect and transmit intelligence. And he became her handler, I think we would say. And they worked together, doing clandestine, transmitting information right up until the middle of 1944, although they stayed in touch subsequently. And so he's able to recount in some detail his version of what went on. There are also a number of autobiographical texts. Josephine Baker's memoirs have recently been translated into English and published by Penguin, actually. As well as a collection of writings by and about Baker, published by her fourth husband very soon after her death. Now, all these works are not without value, but they have to be treated with caution, as Baker had quite a penchant for embellishment. She frequently contradicted herself, and she even indulged in a bit of invention if she thought it would go down well. So for the historian, they're not very reliable documents. However, using these texts as a baseline, with the support of the Leverhulme Trust, who very kindly awarded me a fellowship, I set out on a path to find out more, determined to uncover what I could about Josephine Baker's wartime story in a variety of French, American and British archives as I sought to find out what really went on. So let's just remind ourselves of the wartime geographical scenario. Josephine Baker she was based in Paris. She went from Paris to her chateau in Les Milandes, which you can just spot there in the free zone after the German occupation. And from there she went to Morocco, where she was based in Casablanca. Of course, Morocco, along with Tunisia and Algeria, part of the French Empire, which was after the defeat of France run by Vichy. So there she was, based in Casablanca, yes, that hotbed of espionage that we all know so well from the film. But Josephine Baker actually preferred Marrakesh, which is further south. It was a place that she found the climate to be more favorable, and it was a much more artistic center that appealed to her. In 1943, she did troop tours all around North Africa, performing for the Allied troops who were present there, and she also traveled to the Middle East, as we'll see. She came back to France in October 1944, some months after the liberation of Paris. On her return to Europe, she followed the French First Army, giving benefit concerts, actually with Edith Piaf, in Italy. Then she went to Germany, following the troops into Germany, the French troops into Germany, and she even came on a visit to England in late April, May, and was here 80 years ago at the time of the celebrations of VE Day. So today I want to focus on three key aspects of the book. Firstly, I would like, and this is really a bigger section, if you like, the other sections are a little shorter, talk about Baker and her work as an intelligence agent under cover of her celebrity. She's not at all the profile of the spy who blends in and passes unnoticed. She was both a huge star and a woman of colour, and most of the time she was the only woman, and certainly the only woman of colour, amidst the French circles in which she mixed. So how did she become such an effective spy? Jacques Abté was her handler. Who did they work for? What intelligence were they involved in? And in addressing these questions, we need to distinguish two phases. A first phase, which runs up to November 1942 and the Allied invasion of North Africa, when they were working on behalf of the Allies. Most accounts that do treat Baker's experiences during this period focus mainly on those first years. But Baker actually carried on working as an operative into a second phase, this time working directly for de Gaulle's Chief of Staff in 1943 and 44. And to overlook this, I think, is to miss a really important part of her wartime service. And I hope this will be one of the key contributions of my book. The second theme that I'd like to talk about is how Baker used the war as an opportunity not just to demonstrate her commitment to her French citizenship, but also it was a kind of apprenticeship for her in civil rights. Baker was motivated by her love of France, and she talks a lot about the debt she owed the French because she had become famous because of them. She hated the Nazis. She hated their racism and their anti-Semitism. And she supported, of course, the Allies, the Americans, who were her native country, but also she had a lot of admiration for the British. And overall, she had a very deep personal commitment to de Gaulle, as you will see. In addition to all this, she came to see how she could use her position as a platform to promote African-American servicemen, the ones she met as she was doing her entertainments. And I would argue that some of the things she says at this time foreshadow her later activism in the civil rights movement. And thirdly, and finally, I want to say something about her unique transnational identity, both French and American, which allowed her to adopt a really strongly overt propaganda role alongside her clandestine activities. Her status as both French and American allowed her to reach across cultures and build bridges at times when misunderstandings were rife. And she was able to operate as a remarkably effective propaganda figure to promote the Gaullist resistance cause. And as we shall see, Baker's celebrity was central to each of these aspects and made all her activities possible. Her work as an intelligence agent then. What made Baker such a good spy? Jacques Abté was initially quite reluctant to recruit Josephine Baker. He was taken in by her celebrity image. She was seen as something of an eccentric. There were images of her walking down the Champs-Élysées with her pet leopard in its diamond necklace. And crowds would follow her wherever she went. When she was given a car, hundreds of people turned out to see her learning to drive. Also, the French Secret Services had been somewhat stung by their experiences of the First World War and Mata Hari, and that hadn't turned out too well at all. Poor Mata Hari ended up losing her life. So when Josephine Baker was suggested to Jacques Abté, he was a bit confused and not at all sure that it was a good idea. Yet, she proved to be a remarkably able operative. And unlike him, in fact, she passed unsuspected. Nobody ever suspected she was never suspected of the work she was doing. Her performing, fundraising, and troupe entertainment all provided solid cover. So there were two aspects to this that were really important. Firstly, for information gathering, and this was often related to the people and the circles to whom Josephine Baker had privileged access. For example, during the Phony War in late 1939, while still in Paris, when she first had an approach from Abté, Abté decided to give her a try. He met her and he was quite impressed with the things she had to say. She said she was dedicated to France and she wanted to repay this debt to the French. And he said, okay, let's see what you can do. And Baker contrived to have invitations to embassies. And at these embassies, she went into the Italian embassy. The Italians loved her, actually. She misspoke a little. She was very well liked by Mussolini, apparently. So the Italians held this great respect for her. She got invitations, And she was able to talk to unsuspecting diplomatic officials who, star-tracked by her presence, revealed perhaps a little more than they should have done. You know, what would the Italians do? Were they going to join with Hitler in the war effort? And Josephine Baker allegedly wrote down this information on her arm in little pieces of paper, which she tucked into her clothes, and she reported back to Abte, who thought, well, yes, there really is something here. There is work. She can be useful to us. People talk to her. She also went into the Japanese embassy and was able, similarly, to report back useful information. Later, when they were based in Morocco, once they were established, Baker developed valuable friendships with local elites, those in power, including this figure over there, Tami el-Galawi, the Pasha of Marrakesh, who was absolutely fascinated by Josephine Baker and invited her to his palaces, and they had lavish banquets and people would talk to her, and he had his own circle of spies, and Morocco of this time full of operatives from Germany, from Italy, from Spain, for Americans, British SOE agents, and Tami el-Galawi was a center of interest for everyone. And Josephine Baker, right bang in the middle of what was going on, listening, hearing what people were saying. And as well as Tami in his circle was Mohammed Menebi. You can see him there. That's a still of a newsreel. Unfortunately, we caught it. He's just about to turn his face to the camera. We just missed it. And if you do go to Morocco, his palace, where he gave Josephine Baker rooms in his palace, is now the Museum of Marrakesh. And that's a picture of his palace where she stayed during this period. Contacts like these then helped Baker to be in the know. She could pick up information easily, and she became aware of who the different operatives were, German agents, Italian agents of the Armistice Commission, and so on. She was well placed. She knew how to get information. The second aspect, which made her such a good spy, was for the transfer of information. It's one thing to have the information, but you need to be able to pass it on. You need to be able to get it to the people who need it. Baker, we're in the time of war, borders are closed, but Josephine Baker was able to get the permissions and the visas that others could not. Her first mission perhaps makes the case better than I can. After the fall of France, Baker fled as the Germans bore down on Paris in June 1940 to her wonderful chateau in Les Milandes, and I think some of you told me you'd visited it. I had the pleasure of going there a couple of years ago. This is actually one of my pictures, you can probably tell. She settled there. She took some of her husband's family who were Jewish and sheltered them there. And they were able to, in Dordogne, which was in the free zone of France, so-called free zone, they were able to live relatively peacefully. And Abte soon followed on from Paris. And it becomes quite clear that by this point, Josephine Baker and Abte have a more than professional relationship. They're probably quite involved as a couple by this point. Now, Abte, being in the military, a military intelligence officer, he knew about General de Gaulle. General de Gaulle, who'd made his appeal on the 18th of June 1940 from London, encouraging members of the French military to carry on the battle. He called for the fact that the flame of resistance should not be dead. And Abte wanted to get to London. He wanted to go and join de Gaulle. And Baker was completely excited by this idea. Yes, we have to try and get to London and help de Gaulle at all costs. And with the help of Abte's former superiors, who reconvened their intelligence lines, secretly, though probably with the knowledge of Vichy. It's a very tricky picture. We can talk about it later if you're interested. They were able to make a plan to get to London. Their plan was to get to London. I've got the map again. Via Lisbon. So they would go from their chateau to Lisbon to try and meet with British intelligence. And so it was in late November 1940, Baker, travelling with Abte as her secretary under a false identity, left the chateau by train. You can see it up in the free zone. And they crossed the border from France into Spain. The sight of Josephine Baker walking down the platform in all her furs, this great star who had instant recognition, set the staff of the station alight. The guards were frantic. They rushed home. They fetched their wives. The border was a state of complete effervescence. Everyone was asking for Josephine Baker's autograph. Meanwhile, Jacques Abte, dressed in disguise as her secretary, with important documents from the French Secret Services in his briefcase, allegedly in invisible ink and in code, written on Josephine Baker's music scores, I think it might be a little embellished by crime novels of the time, crept through the border completely unnoticed. Okay, this was just the first example, but time and time again, Baker's celebrity made it possible for her to travel and also to facilitate the movement of others at a time when it was really difficult for people to get around. Now, at this point, Baker and Abte were definitely, their main drive was to get to de Gaulle and work in the interests of the Allies. But they didn't make it to London. They did manage to meet with British intelligence in Lisbon, but the British, starved of information about what was going on in France and what was going on in North Africa, sent them back. They said, go back, you're much more useful to us if you can report what's going on in France. And they said, then move to Casablanca, and in Casablanca, we will set up a network. You can collect information from French agents, bring it and pass it on to us in Lisbon. And so the British plan was to have Baker and Abte at the heart of this new intelligence network. However, once Baker and Abte did get to Morocco in January 1941, it immediately became clear that although Baker could get clearance to travel, Abte had come under suspicion. After all, he'd been working as an agent since 1936, so he was a known element. People recognized that he was probably an agent. So Baker was compelled to act alone. And as we have seen, she could travel more easily. And she was very conscious of it. She would say, you know, no one would dare to search Josephine Baker, she would say. So she ended up making trips to Lisbon and Spain under cover of doing performances and shows. From March, April 1941, for example, she undertook an intelligence gathering mission. The Allies were terrified that Hitler would make an alliance with Franco and invade North Africa through French Morocco. So they sent Josephine Baker up through Spanish Morocco. She went to Tétouan, she went to Tangiers, and then she did a conference, she did a series of concerts in Seville, Barcelona, Valencia, Madrid, and she came back and she reported to actually to Abte and the French Secret Services that there was no evidence of German troop movements and so on. However, Baker and Abte's work for the Allies came to an abrupt halt in July 1941 when Baker fell dangerously ill and fought for her life in a clinic in Casablanca. She was completely out of action for many months, but thankfully she did recover. It's not entirely clear what was wrong with her. It may have been a miscarriage that went wrong. She may have had an intervention and caught peritonitis, but she really was extremely ill. Now, while she was out of action during this period, the Americans arrived in North Africa. They'd been a slight presence, but from March 1941, there was an agreement with Roosevelt to bring in food into North Africa, and Roosevelt was able to use this agreement to send in operatives who were called vice consuls, who were actually agents of the Office of Strategic Services, the very embryonic form of the CIA. Their mission was to inform on conditions in North Africa, and later, as America became embroiled in the war and moving further along, to lay the groundwork for what would be the invasion of North Africa. So in the course of 1942, Josephine Baker would have long periods of recovery and convalescence. And during this period, her hospital bed became a convenient place of rendezvous for secrets and exchanges to be made. What could be more natural than an American officer calling at the clinic? I've just come to see how Josephine Baker is today. And he'd go up to her room, and there would be some French Secret Service agents, some of the Moroccan notables that Josephine Baker knew, and members of the local resistance, all waiting and preparing for the invasion of North Africa. And indeed, during the invasion of North Africa, Baker was able to offer valuable help. I was able to uncover the account of an officer of the Counterintelligence Corps, a certain Lieutenant Paul Jensen, who reported on a significant role that Baker had played in helping him and his men during the crucial weeks after the landings, when the Americans needed to secure Morocco. He indicated that Baker had supported their mission, I quote, at great risk to her own life. She had supplied the names of all German agents in the area, and drawing on her intimate knowledge of the situation in Marrakesh, under her guidance and with the intelligence she was able to provide, his unit was able to counteract the subversive efforts of the German Armistice Commission. With the Allies now present in North Africa, we move into this second phase I talked about, and the intelligence work she did, working directly for the Gaullists. In the second half of 1943, Baker with Abte, along with other colleagues, undertook a propaganda mission to promote the cause of de Gaulle. Of course, General de Gaulle wasn't widely known at this time across the whole of North Africa and the Middle East. And secretly, they were being tasked with collecting intelligence on the activities of British and Americans, particularly in relation to the growing Arab nationalist movement across the Middle East. The Gaullists were deeply suspicious of the British, who had ambitions in the region, and with good reason. General Spears, protected by his friendship with Churchill, was orchestrating trouble. He was trying to get the Arabs to rise up against the French and to the advantage of the British. So Baker and her companions used troop entertainment as a cover to visit various destinations throughout the Middle East. And you can see they left Marrakesh, they traveled in jeeps, and they went on this extraordinary journey all across Algeria. They had 2 jeeps traveling, and in 10 days, it took them 10 days to reach Cairo. And they went, they slept raft, and you can see, I talk in some detail about this trip in the book, that Josephine Baker was completely committed. They would stop off on the way, entertain troops, and they got to Egypt, and they were able to talk to a wide range of circles, including King Farouk of Egypt, and to report to Algiers on what was going on the ground. And indeed, the situation of the French, quite frankly, did not look good. Okay, I think I'm running a little bit behind, so I will skip on to my second theme. Okay, The war is an opportunity for Baker to demonstrate her French citizenship and as an apprenticeship in civil rights. In her autobiographical documents, Josephine Baker movingly describes how her wartime service was motivated by her sense of gratitude, as I said, to the French people who'd made her a star. Let's understand this would not have been possible in the US under segregation. She was also driven by her hatred of the Nazis and their racism, which she experienced firsthand in 1929 on visits to Germany and Austria, when she was vilified by them. They heckled in her concerts, they called her the Black Devil, and she knew what Nazism was, and she knew how threatened she would be personally were she to be caught. Having become a French citizen, on her marriage to Jean Lion in 1937, her new nationality was a source of great pride to her. Importantly, their union made her keenly aware of the dangers faced by Jews. Jean Lion was Jewish, and even though their marriage actually was unsuccessful, it barely lasted. They were divorced in 1941. She remained very fond of the family, particularly her mother-in-law. She was very close to her, and she was attracted to Judaism. I spoke to her son about this when we met, and he told me that she started the process of conversion. It's very difficult as a woman to become a Jew, but she always carried with her a Jewish prayer book. She really had a real empathy with Judaism. However, along with these motivations, I found that she also came to see the war as an opportunity to promote the role being played by African-American servicemen in ways that she hoped would help their case for equality. In spring 1943, before leaving for the Middle East, Baker carried out an extensive camp tour entertaining the American troops who were stationed in North Africa. She was immensely well received by troop audiences, but her shows brought her face to face with the realities of life for African-American servicemen who were relegated to the most unpleasant tasks in the military, working in canteens, doing heavy building work. They weren't allowed on active duty. Baker was therefore once again confronted with the harsh realities of segregation that she'd been so delighted to leave behind when she arrived in France. Now, scholars like Tyler Stovall have shown how before the war, Baker was so disgusted with the Americans. She did an American tour in 1936 and it didn't go well. They just didn't get her, that she distanced herself. She also distanced herself from the African-American community, which thrived in Paris between the wars. Jazz was a big thing, and there were many jazz musicians. Of course, they all left when the war broke out. But Josephine Baker kept her distance and sought to embrace her French identity. However, now confronted once again with their plight, and you can see how there are many articles like these, Josephine Baker meeting them after her concerts, pictures of these African-American servicemen, you can see her in these interviews become increasingly willing to speak out about her race, as she termed it. She commented to one reporter that she was, I quote, "so proud and thrilled at the great advancement that my race is making in this war." In an interview for the Chicago Defender, when asked about her motivations to perform, she was clear. "First, I want to do what I can to win the war, and thus perform whatever duty I can for my native land. Second, I want to help those of my own race. I'm doing all I can to help win the war effort and to make people generally more appreciative and kinder to my race." Such pronouncements were frequent, although they stopped when she became an auxiliary officer of the French Air Force the following year. But they point to her growing consciousness of the way she could mobilize her platform to promote the causes she believed in. And she would use this platform in a similar way when it came to promoting the cause of de Gaulle and the Free French. And this brings me to my third and final section about how Baker was able to mobilize her transnational identity to become a superb propagandist and quasi-ambassadorial figure. We've seen how Baker's stardom and reputation helped her to open doors, and this, combined with her national affiliations, French and American, as well as the fact that she was a woman of colour, gave her an entree into a whole range of milieu in North Africa and across the Middle East, enabling her to gain acceptance and promote the Free French, not just on stage, but off stage too. Newspaper articles chart the various dinners she attended, the places she visited as she carried out this important work. Thomas Young, I'm sorry, it's not a very good picture, you can just make it out. Thomas Young, correspondent for the New Journal and Guide, accompanied Baker to a post-performance meal in the palace of a local Moroccan notable. The image that appeared under the headline, "Officers, Muslims meet at party for Josephine Baker," Joe Baker, they call her Joe Baker, sometimes Joe with an E, odd, shows the beaming star, the only woman seated with 9 men, including both white and African-American officers in uniform and Moroccans in traditional dress. Baker, he recounts, was the life and soul of the evening. She rattled away to everyone in French and English during the meal, getting people to talk to each other. And then, during the after-dinner conversations, she left her seat, she went next door, and she chatted to the ladies. So here she is moving across all these different groups. Her 1943 tour of the Middle East, the one that you saw with her going in jeeps, and she also raised a lot of significant funds for the interior resistance during this tour, had proved her effectiveness promoting de Gaulle. And in recognition of this, in the spring of 1944, she was named a second lieutenant propaganda officer of the Auxiliary Corps of the French Air Force. Why the French Air Force? Josephine Baker, she knew how to fly an aeroplane. She learned to fly a plane in the 30s, and she and Jean Lion were both pilots, and they would go off flying together. He was incredibly rich. This was mainly during their courtship, in fact. And here we can see her, I have many more photos of this period, obviously, because she was a propaganda officer, and there are lots more photographs that could circulate, with her superior officer, Major Hanna Diamond, and she was a really interesting source for me, because most of the people who write about Baker were men, but here she had left some documentation that I was able to use, giving the woman's view of her work. And a very clear positioning here, de Gaulle's picture in the background. We know where we are with this, the French resistance and the Cross of Lorraine. And this picture really went around the world. And Josephine Baker continued her entertainment work. Have to be said, her clandestine life really disappears into the background at this point, but she is promoting de Gaulle very actively. And on one of these missions, which I may not have time to talk to you, oh, sorry, it's jumped for some reason. It's got stuck. There. On the 6th of June, in fact, D-Day, they were told it was D-Day before they left, they went on a mission to Corsica to entertain the troops in Corsica just after the liberation of Corsica. And Josephine Baker had a bit of an adventure. This is the page from the Diary of Operations of the French Ministerial Air Liaison Group, who've written an account of their trip. And you can see they went off in an aeroplane known as the Seagull, the Gaullist, and it got into difficulty. It crashed into the sea. And here you can see Josephine Baker standing on the plane, and the Senegalese rifleman who was stationed in Corsica, who swam out to save them and took her to shore on their backs. It's a wonderful story. I couldn't resist not showing you. And here you see Josephine Baker saw this, was shown this account and signed it as true to what had happened in 1946. And Josephine Baker was prepared to do impromptu performances. Here we see her giving a performance. Actually, this is for a general of the Air Force at his villa. and he's obviously entertaining some Americans and some younger people. And she also, picture comes from later, but I wanted to show you this huge flag that she had made. And this flag, wherever she went to give her concerts, at the moment she would sing J'ai deux amours, which was her hymn, I have two loves, my country and Paris. This flag would come tumbling down in a moment of great emotion. And I read a lot of servicemen, French servicemen, who found this to be a really profoundly moving moment. Josephine Baker somehow had become for them the symbol of Paris, and here she was representing so effectively the Gaullist cause. And here we have a picture of her on her return. She's just returned in October 1944 in her army uniform to Marseille, and this magazine artist said, La reconnaissez-vous? Do you recognize her? So here's this great star. Of course, for the French public, this was quite new. Nobody knew that she'd been involved in the war effort. And here she is, back in Paris, giving an interview to Défense la France, that would become France ce soir, emphasizing, Je ne suis qu'un soldat. I'm just a soldier. I'm just a soldier doing my job for the cause of France and the Allies. And here we have a picture of her. This is another still from a newsreel. There she is, trying to boost the morale of the French troops in Alsace. It's incredibly cold, and this is Josephine Baker in typical form, handing out cigarettes, having a giggle with the men, and, you know, they all loved it and so appreciated her presence. And here she is on a this is a film, a magazine that was shown to French soldiers, and here she's singing her J'ai deux amours, and in the backdrop, here we have scene of the opera, Paris, and the scene of the tropical North African. Here she was, this icon, this symbol of the Gaullist cause in Paris, but also drawing on that North African background. In April, May, as I said, she came to England, where she carried out a series of ad hoc performances in factories, hospitals, and army camps, and it culminated in a show in London on the 14th of May, where she performed with Noel Coward, and they had actually crossed when she was in Egypt. He'd also been entertaining troops, and he had really very good things to say about her in his memoirs. And she finished the trip in Yorkshire, where she visited the French airmen stationed there. And the AFPHD kindly gave me permission to publish this picture of her visit. I'm nearly finished now. Baker proved an effective propaganda figure. She was familiar and reassuring. She had recognition. Whereas de Gaulle was no more than a name for most French people. They knew his name, many had heard his voice, but they didn't know what he looked like. He was, you know, an unknown figure. He was Josephine Baker, this great interwar star who was supporting the Gaullists. Her link with the Air Force was also valuable at a time when the Air Force was struggling to defend its reputation due to its poor showing during the battles of 1939 to 40. And there's no doubting that Baker's appearances, particularly in North Africa and the Middle East, a woman of colour who had successfully become a huge star, and she really was a huge star, made her a powerful symbol of France's apparent tolerance and openness to ethnic diversity. But her support for Gaullism also set her against the growing nationalist movements that were developing at this time across North Africa and the Middle East, in what were essentially the beginnings of decolonization. In January 1944, the Moroccan nationalist movement Istiqlal published their agenda for independence, placing themselves in direct opposition to the Gaullists. The Gaullist French protectorate. De Gaulle really wanted to keep up the French Empire and keep France its great position across the world. Baker made it clear She considered their demands to be premature, and she told her Moroccan friends, and she told them that they should back down and back off. This was a very clear positioning on her part. Her passionate support for de Gaulle and France on the one hand, and her interest in the fate of the African Americans in the US would lead to a tension in her attitudes to freedom that I've attempted to pull out in the book. And this really marks her post-war life. While she became increasingly outspoken about civil rights, and she indulged in this experiment we saw, bringing up all these children, showing the world that humans are all the same underneath, she never spoke out in criticism of the atrocities which marked France's involvement in decolonization. And she did get very criticized for that. So Baker had a good war. Decommissioned in September 1945, she emerged a hero. Unlike many other entertainers like Maurice Chevalier and indeed Edith Piaf, who found themselves under investigation for being implicated with the enemy. In 1946, Baker was awarded the Resistance Medal, and here we see her actually, she was once again laid up, a similar problem recurring in her clinic bed when she received the medal. And despite being turned down for the Légion d'honneur twice, she finally gained the award in 1958. We can perhaps talk about why there was such delay. I think it was largely linked to confusion around Abte's allegiances. Abte was a bit of a player. He played on all sides, and the Gaullists didn't like that. The formal award ceremony, you can see here, finally took place in 1961 at the chateau, and she used it actually as a huge publicity opportunity. There are pictures of her surrounded by the children as well. And we can see in this letter, this is a letter that she writes to de Gaulle. She wanted de Gaulle to pin the medal on her, and he couldn't do that. So she writes to him and says how sorry she is. But the reason I've put this up is I'd like you to note the term she uses to denote herself. Je reste votre fidèle sale Gaulliste. And it was Yvonne de Gaulle in July 1943 at their first meeting, who referred to Josephine Baker as une sale petite Gaulliste, a naughty little Gaullist. She was so excitable. In fact, at this first meeting, he was in the balcony and she sang to him. Actually, he was in a box and she sang to him, and she was so moved she couldn't sing. She sort of burst into tears on the stage. She really was deeply committed to the man, extraordinary. And this comes, oh dear, what have I done?
Says the external display is disconnected. Do we have tech support? I think.
Can we go back to?
Yeah, we need to go back to the screen.
Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Well, anyway, perhaps we flick through?
Yes.
I mean, I'm almost there. These are just the last few slides now. Sorry about that, I must have pressed something.
It said the external display became disconnected, so oops, now we've gone too far.
There we are.
The sale Gaulliste.
Sale Gaulliste, yeah.
Is that?
And this is from the correspondence, her correspondence with de Gaulle during the post-war period, held in the National Archives. She wrote to him all the time. I saw you do that speech. Perhaps you should be a little less forthcoming about this and say more about that. And she absolutely did not hold back. And every 18th of June, when he'd given his great speech from London, she sent him a telegram. Votre fidèle Josephine Baker. She really was. And de Gaulle answers her always very cordially. And thank you, madam. Thank you for your kind words. He was not one to indulge in much emotional, but publicly. I think he was really very fond of her, though. Okay, I'll try and do this without making a mess. Voila. In November 2021, Josephine Baker's life was celebrated by the symbolic transfer of her ashes to the Pantheon, and this is the programme of the event. And this is the highest honour someone can receive in the French state. And President Macron announced that Baker's war service was a crucial reason for his choice. Okay, I have now got to the end. I wanted to leave some time for questions. I hope that I've given you a taste of Baker's wartime story and how this unique, multifaceted figure used her position, her celebrity, to do great service for the Allies and her country. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. An absolutely fascinating overview of a side of the woman that we never knew, which certainly justifies anybody's purchase of the book. Available not only in all good bookshops, but here at the front later on. We have possibly 10 minutes for questions before we adjourn to wine. So may I see, first of all, if there are any indications in the room? Yes, sir. What if you'd like to ask your question, what I shall then do is repeat it for the benefit of those who are online. So.
I have a problem, which is that my father-in-law, who was French, was in the same resistance group as Josephine Baker. The problem is I can't see how she could have spent all that time doing just that. What do you know about her period in Paris, it would have been, as a member of the resistance?
So the question was, the gentleman asking the question, his father-in-law was involved in the French resistance in the same group as Josephine Baker. And so Hannah has been asked of her knowledge of Josephine Baker's activities whilst in Paris.
It's a bit peculiar. She never was in Paris. She left Paris in the early days of June 1940, and she didn't go back until October 1944. And she never joined a resistance group. She worked as an intelligence agent mainly in North Africa. But she worked for de Gaulle's Free French, but she was never a member of a resistant group. She was not a card-carrying resistor. And I've been very careful, I think, when I've talked about her, not to say that she was in the resistance, because she wasn't. She worked for the benefit of the resistance. She raised money, she was involved in resistance activities, but she was not a member of the French resistance. It would have been impossible. She left Paris before, and even her time in Dordogne, she was in the Dordogne. Some people have tried to claim that she was involved in resistance, but I went through the archives in Dordogne. There wasn't any resistance in the Dordogne at the time she was there. So, yeah, she wasn't, I'm afraid. I don't know where your father's information came from, but it doesn't tally with the archive sources that I have consulted, I'm afraid. She wasn't a resistor in that sense. I'm afraid I can't say more than that.
Jane.
Thanks, Hannah. Gosh, that was so illuminating. And curiously, I think the picture you paint of Baker is actually something of an enigma, which might be appropriate for her spy's identity. So I just wanted to ask, when you were reading the reading the papers in the archives and researching her, I mean, you conveyed brilliantly her sense of loyalty and her heroism. But what about her as a person? I mean, was she kind of just an annoying egotist, actually? Or, I mean, what kind of woman was she? Was she prone to fall in love, out of love? Could you just tell us a little bit about her as a person?
So the question was, enigma, egotist, helplessly falling in and out of love. What's your view?
Okay, good summary. Well, I think she was a passionate soul. I think she she desperately wanted to be liked, and she had a real gift for engaging with people. You know, one of the most useful sources to me were these, she would talk to journalists, and she loved, you know, if she saw a journalist, sit down and talk to them, and of course, but she loved to interact with people. She was very gay, merry. She always had a coterie of animals with her. She had a menagerie of animals when she was in Marrakesh. She built up, though, the animals. She travelled with animals. She was, I think, she was, I see her as very multi-layered because she had this slightly trivial persona on the exterior, but in some ways that's what made her such a good spy, because her own sort of true self was deeply hidden. And I don't think many people saw it. But she did seem to attract people. You know, she loved being the life and soul of the party. I saw some of the invitations that were sent out for one of the parties in Morocco, and it was, you know, come and meet Josephine Baker at this banquet. So, yeah, I think she revelled in all that. But, yeah, she did enjoy. She had a penchant for enjoying life, though. She would, you know, does that sort of give you a bit of insight?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's heresy to say this, but I was thinking a lot about Gabrielle Chanel when you were speaking about her and their involvement as celebrity figures, obviously from very different perspectives during the war, and the way in which Chanel very publicly fabricated versions of her life to make herself more palatable to whomever she was speaking. Anyway, sorry, I'm going on a bit, but it was just that something about those women who were effectively good at creating a surface or surfaces.
I think we have to remember, with Josephine Baker, she was 19 when she came to Paris in 1925. So she lived all her adult, even her young adult life, as a celebrity. So she learnt to appeal to people. She sort of had that. I think her celebrity was very central to the person she was.
I've seen a couple more questions in the audience, but before that, Lindsay at the back of the room, do we have any online questions? Splendid. As we have no online questions, that means that the three people who've indicated they wish to speak we'll take, and then perhaps we'll call it a day. So I saw a hand here, and a hand there. So lady in blue, then the gentleman, and then the lady in green.
Very quick. Could she speak a lot of languages? Because she obviously mixed with different peoples, and she must have had to understand what they were saying.
Yeah, allegedly she did, allegedly. And she used to sing. She used to, she had, when she was in Spain, the articles I read about her performances in Spain said she sang in, she liked to sing in the language of the people she was singing for. She even sang some Russians. On one occasion, a Russian delegation was invited to a concert, so she went out of her way to sing a Russian song. I don't think she spoke Russian, but she, you know, this was part of her desire to please, you know, and she could, yeah, she spoke, obviously she spoke French, although she learned French. She had to learn French from scratch. And when she arrived in 1925, she didn't actually write and read very good English. And some of her written English is a bit dodgy. Her French is actually, when I read her letters, her French is actually better than her English at times, grammatically speaking anyway. She, I think she spoke decent French. Spanish. I don't think she learned Arabic. She must have known a smattering. But yeah, she did, this desire to appeal meant that she was very interested in languages and in communicating.
I was just going to ask, did she ever get to speak with de Gaulle in person?
Yes, she did. She met him in 1943 at this concert, in fact, for the first time, and she went to see him in his box, and he gave her a Croix de Lorraine, the Lorraine Cross, do we say in gold, which she kept, but she did actually sell it to make money for the interior French resistance later in the war. But yes, she did. She did speak to him, and he actually did go and visit her once or twice in the chateau undercover. He wasn't very public, and he invited her often. When he was president, she would come to receptions and so on. And she supported him. She would sometimes perform at rallies in the post-war period. And she supported him in May '68 as well. You know, she marched in favour of de Gaulle. So yeah, she was very committed to him.
And our final question. No, it wasn't a question.
No.
In that case, we have no more questions. So it only really remains for me to ask you to join with me in thanking Hanna for what has been an absolutely enchanting, enthralling, enticing discussion of Josephine Baker and what she did in this period, which is so poorly discussed. I'm sure you will be anxious to obtain a copy of the book. It's all right, I'm not on commission.
Who needs a publicist?
But what is important, I think, is that Hanna has demonstrated the skill of the historian in going beneath the surface, in getting into the character, and we've seen the multifaceted life that Josephine Baker has led in a way which has never really been discussed until now. So please join me in thanking her.
Thank you.